Hello, I'm Adam Zufall. I'm a PhD student here in the Center for Spaceflight Research at UC Davis. Let me just show you around the lab and some of the cool projects that we're working on. We are using these two robot arms to study human-robot interactions, and especially with AI explainability, so that you can know, if you're a human working with a robot on a particular task, why the robot is taking certain actions and understand it better. To the right, we have changes, which stands for countermeasure for the human adaptation of novel gravitational environments. And they're looking at employing head tracking movements to help train astronauts how to not get sick when they go into a microgravity environment. So you can see on these photos some of the zero-G flights that they've taken and the human experiments that they've done. And again, tracking how can we train astronauts to move better to avoid getting sick while in space. This poster is for their HMD, or helmet mounted display technology, that we've been working on. You can see that they've actually been able to test this in the neutral buoyancy lab at Johnson Space Center. That's where astronauts go in a gigantic swimming pool to test out spacewalk technologies. And so this helmet mounted display will be a more efficient means of communicating information to astronauts to help them while they're on a spacewalk, either tracking their metabolic rates or tracking their progress on a certain task. In this corner we have the HCAAM project, which uses this Honda generator to step proto-astronauts through different kinds of procedures, which is very important that we write procedures differently as we start going to deep space, because we won't be able to communicate as easily with those astronauts and give them feedback on the task that they're doing. So if they're repairing something, they need to be able to do it all on their own and not be able to talk to mission control. And we're using these iPads to introduce augmented reality into the task. So you can see here on this view, if you're repairing the generator, the augmented reality view on the iPad would be able to tell you if you're turning the right screw, or to help you find parts or not missteps as you're walking yourself through the procedure fixing this component on a spacecraft. And it is being incorporated into the HERA setup at NASA Johnson, which is a 45-day trial of humans in a space habitat doing a lot of different experiments. So it has been very successful over there, and we're excited to continue working on it. The project on this table is not a broken bicycle like it might appear, but it will actually eventually be a prototype laundry machine. So currently on the International Space Station, we have no method of doing laundry. Astronauts just wear their clothing until it's too dirty, and then they throw it away. And that's just not acceptable when we start going to Mars or other deep space launches, because we just can't bring that much clothing with us. So we need a way to do laundry in space. And so these different sensors are ways of telling what contaminants are in the wastewater, so you can see what dirt and salts and things you're actually removing from the clothing. We also have sensors to track the speed of the input from this bicycle. And why we're using a bicycle is that we can actually make the laundry machine into an exercise device. And exercising is very important for astronauts to avoid getting sick while they're in space, and to avoid other injuries while they're in space. So you can combine two devices into one, have an exercise machine to help you stay healthy, and a laundry machine to help keep your clothes clean. On the right here, we have a drone, an aerial vehicle. And what's special about it is it has vertical takeoff and landing, but it transitions to fixed wing flight to extend its range. So while it's in the air, it will fly forward like a traditional plane, but then it can transition to this kind of up and down motion to land. And that's important for, again, extending the range while still being able to take off and land in very cramped environments. and we're looking at using that for agricultural settings, again, to take measurements, to take air samples while we're in the field. In this corner, we have a prototype ECLSS system, and ECLSS stands for Environmental Control and Life Support System. So this is what monitors all the gases in your space habitat to make sure that there is not too much CO2 building up, that you have enough oxygen to breathe, and that it's all cycled and balanced correctly. And obviously, we've been flying those sorts of systems in space for decades, but this is looking at a particular technology and specifically introducing faults. So if we can introduce problems to the system and understand how the system responds when those problems occur, then we'll have a more robust system that we can trust and that we know it will do its job even when off-nominal situations come up. And that's very important, again, for trusting these systems in deep space habitats where we might not have many options if things go wrong. And so we want to know what the system looks like and how it behaves as those problems occur, so that we can fix them before we have a complete failure of the system. And last but certainly not least, we have this gigantic skeleton of aluminum structure that will eventually become a space habitat mock-up. So we will be putting a shell on this, we'll be putting an interior on this to make it look like a module on, say, the International Space Station, and then we'll be able to run experiments on the inside to know, again, can we test procedures, can we test living conditions, can we test some of these technologies that I've already shown you in a more realistic environment. And we're planning to have it be very modular, so we can bring in experimenters from other universities. Some of them we're already collaborating with, such as UC Davis, of course us here, also at CU Boulder, Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech, Texas A&M, USC, Howard, all of these universities that have experiments that they want to run either on astronauts or procedures or other space technologies, and they'd be able to run those experiments in our space habitat mock-up. So those are some of the projects here just in this first room, but now let's go over to the satellite lab and I can show you some more. So this is our satellite lab. This is where we work on satellite technologies, we do electronics, we build a lot of hardware, and we have a little fun. So let's take you around and look at all the projects here. These are two prototype hang gliders, which we will be using on a high altitude flight. So they will be launched out of a balloon and then safely fly a data vault back to a predetermined landing zone. This is very important because currently NASA is sending up these high altitude balloons and gathering a lot of scientific data on high altitude telescopes, but it's so much data they can't beam it down wirelessly and they have to transport it on a hard drive. And so it would be much easier to, instead of putting it on a parachute and you have no idea where it's going to land, you can put this data vault on a glider and have it come back to a predetermined safe landing zone. And we will be competing this August in the final competition of actually demonstrating this technology on a real flight. So we are looking forward to that. On the left here, you have again a prototype as we're testing things. So this is testing our guidance and navigation algorithms. And you can see that this little car is not a glider, but allows us to test some of the same techniques and technologies, such as using a GPS or using a compass, using a radio, that we will be using on the glider, but a car has the advantage that it doesn't crash every time you get something wrong. So it allows us to test our technologies much faster and with lower risk than going out for a test flight every single day. This corner of the lab is dedicated to the HDD, or hard disk drive project, which is looking at creating affordable reaction wheels for CubeSats. So we have a couple examples of hard disk drives here. They're the same ones found in your computer, but we're using them for momentum control rather than data storage. The basic idea is that you spin this wheel and that creates a torque that can then rotate your spacecraft. And that allows you to control where your spacecraft is pointing, which is very desirable for lots of different missions. The problem is, these are very expensive when you buy them for most satellites. But hard disk drives like these are mass produced for computers, and so they're orders of magnitude cheaper. You can get them for hundreds of dollars rather than thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. These are photos from when the HDD, the hard disk drive project, was tested on a zero-G flight. As you can see, it was a lot of fun, but it's also very difficult to test this technology in the constraints of an aircraft. But we got a lot of data and it was very successful. And 2 students are now writing up their theses, which will be published in a couple months. So you can see the operation of putting the CubeSat inside this cage and cameras on either side that was capturing its position and orientation while we were conducting the experiment. These are the actual cameras that we used to capture the position and orientation of the CubeSat during those experiments. And you can also see the Aruco markers, these fiducial tags that allow the computer system to better catch the CubeSat and identify it in the frame of the video. Here is one of those fiducial markers and a camera, and you can see in the live view how the camera is actually capturing the position and the orientation of the fiducial marker. And so with that information, we can calculate the CubeSat's position and rotation during the experiment. This device is called an air bearing, and as you can see, it kind of floats on this cushion of pressurized air, and that allows it to translate with very little friction, and it also allows it to rotate with very little friction. And so this allows us to test different satellite technologies, such as thrusters, sensors, actuators, in a more space-like environment, because there is no gravitational effect when it's moving in this plane. Currently, if there's a problem on a space habitat like the International Space Station, you have to send a human out to take care of it. And that can take days to actually plan a spacewalk and then execute the spacewalk to go get eyes on a problem. So the technology we're working on is a satellite instead that you could deploy out of the International Space Station, and then it could orbit around and look at a problem immediately and start gathering information. That would improve the safety of the entire spacecraft. To do that, we developed a payload called HIO, which stands for Handrail Inspection on Orbit. And so this technology is looking at a computer vision algorithm that can actually identify these handrails. So these handrails are all outside the International Space Station. Astronauts use them to pull themselves along during spacewalks. And what we've done is we've trained a computer model to be able to use a camera to identify when a handrail is in an image. And that will let us use these handrails as landmarks to help the satellite navigate itself while it's in orbit around the International Space Station. And this will launch later this year in order to test the lighting conditions that we see on orbit, because computer vision models are very sensitive to changes in lighting conditions. And so we actually want to test it in orbit on a spacecraft. And part of this is also looking at infrared versus visual light. So you can see the difference between 2 images, one captured in the infrared and one captured in the visual spectrum. And that again will make the technology more robust and improve our ability to detect handrails and then navigate around the International Space Station exterior. This is our space ambulance mock-up. It's a very large structure. And the point behind this project is currently, if you're on the International Space Station and you have some sort of medical emergency, you have to go in this very cramped capsule to get back to Earth to receive medical attention. And you can tell that that is not ideal conditions, You'd much rather be able to attend to the patient while you're deorbiting. So we can see this is kind of a mock-up of you'd have the pilot, the patient, and the physician being able to attend to the person having the medical emergency. And so we built this full-scale model in order to test different experiments, how to get people inside, the optimal layout of the spacecraft. You can see the stretcher here for the patient, but you can also see these colored lines here. What we did is we gave a pen to the physician sitting in that seat and asked them to stretch out and mark how far that they could reach while still in their seat. And that informs us of where we should put medication, where we should put different tools in order to, again, optimize the layout of this spacecraft. And there's some things you just don't learn until you build a full-scale model and get people inside of it, which you can tell, again, by the difference in arm length in our different participants in this experiment. So those are most of the projects we're working on here at UC Davis. Thank you for joining me.